when I looked for spaces where we could discuss the gender dynamics in the Black community outside of the rubric of Black feminism, I didn't find many spaces. I didn't find any spaces in the academy willing to do it. I didn't find it in social circles. We had been socialized in many respects to revere mama to such a degree where any type of criticism, you either met with a confused silence or hostility by even raising the question. I found there were a lot of scholars that would shake my hand, proverbially speaking. You know, they would email me, text me, sometimes at a conference, shake my hand in the hallway. But as far as being seen publicly, I would get a lot of thank yous. I get a lot of brothers, even professors, who would listen to my work online, sitting in their cars before they walk in the house. Some would buy my publications under the table, but not tell anybody about it. There were a few brothers that would actually make it assigned reading in my coursework, but not a lot. Not a lot. It was very, it was considered highly controversial. And one of the reasons I came to YouTube was because I refused to publish, probably for a good 5 years. I didn't stop writing, but I stopped publishing outside of my own blog because I found that many of the publishing companies, as well as the journals I was applying to, were so concerned with catering to feminists that the very subject matter I was interested in, before I even wrote it, before they even could read it, was considered so offensive it wasn't even worth publishing. And a couple of the publications I got through were just horrendous. I mean, horrendous. It was difficult trying to get things through because the training we had was to pedestalize feminist discourse to such a degree that it was beyond questioning, beyond reproach. Even Black male feminists, and there were many that I went to school with, and many I was urged to study at the behest of some of my feminist colleagues, mostly female, would send me to. The Black male feminists I would read, they would basically just repeat the same talking points on intersectionality. It was the same talking points, almost word for word. And one of the things I noticed, in order for them to maintain their status, they never pushed back. But what I found with Black male feminists is that they would mostly never push back. They would never recontextualize or raise question. It functioned much like many women's studies departments do, women and gender studies departments do. It functioned more like a religion than it did a field of study. Because in the academy, you're supposed to be able to question, and it doesn't have to be a hostile engagement. But what I found is when it came to feminism, it was very much like being an atheist in a church. And that's how you were treated, as a heretic, a blasphemer, right? Anybody who questions these dialogues is automatically placed in a category of being a misogynist, being someone who hates women simply for questioning. Now, the Black manosphere is not solely preoccupied with critiquing women, contrary to popular assumption, but that is a feature of it. And I'm saying it only came about because of its purposeful removal from other aspects of communal development, social development. We didn't have it. Women were not to be critiqued at all. And you can't function like that in a community. Now, part of the reason that was such is because, for the most part, our women had support. They had support from the state. And I've talked about this for years. What we call the gynocracy is really the result of everything from government organizations and institutions to NGOs providing resources to women that Black men didn't get. And over time, that created different behavioral patterns in women. It even created an entitlement because the safety networks, what do you call it? What's that called? The safety nets in place for women over the years didn't apply to Black men. So many women developed a superiority complex. These are what complicated the social dynamics between men and women. I'm going to do a video soon on an interview that took place about education. It was, I want to say it was a white man, a Black man, and 3 women talking about how boys are not learning in schools. And the conversation they had was so problematic. They refused to acknowledge the mechanisms that were put in place for the last 40 to 45 years, 50 years really, on behalf of girls in schools, even at the K through 6 level, that boys did not get, in environments that were overwhelmingly female. And the culture of learning was female influenced. And that meant that boys were measured against a female model that was never discussed aloud. And when they failed to meet that model by not learning and operating as girls in those classrooms, being graded by grown women, people were surprised that they didn't do well. So my point here is when we talk about the kind of framework of how Black men and women have dealt with each other, we refuse to acknowledge the resources that produced the behavior that many Black men complained about over the last 50 years. Now, it's not to say we didn't have complaints prior to that, but it blew to a disproportionate level afterwards. The entitlement is something that we just, for the most part, had difficulty talking about, to the point that we didn't. This is why when you saw the rise of Black feminism in the late 70s and the 1980s, particularly over mainstream television and film, Black men never had an organized response. Individual men had certain responses, from rappers to, the random scholar, but you really didn't see an organized response until the last 15 odd years. We were not trained to do that. And that's why this space came to exist, because it came to exist to fill a need that nobody wanted to acknowledge, except for many Black men themselves. But we shamed each other for wanting that need to be addressed. So there was conflict from the beginning. As an educator for the last 25 years, from K to college, every time I sought to obtain funding and support for Black boys and men, I was shut down officially or promised funds that never came. Exactly. What I'm talking about here isn't just about fighting on social media. I'm talking about structural issues. I'm talking about resources that are policy-based, that did not go to Black men and boys in any significant numbers. And many of the women that gaslit us and told us that they don't know what we were talking about when we tried to bring that up. But one of the things we found is that in the last month or so, I've never seen this many women coming out talking about the biased history of treatment for Black men and the need for the community to come together. Well, it's useful for that discourse at this point, because so many people are losing jobs. And now they see the benefit of working with Black men. But prior to this last few months, when Black men would talk about this legacy of institutional exclusion, silence. As long as there were resources for Black women, silence. Black men that wanted to speak were silenced. Again, this is why I came to YouTube and I stopped publishing for 5 years, because I was excluded from the mechanisms. I was excluded from the institutions that normally one would publish with, because the topic was considered unpalatable. Now, here's the interesting rub. By the time my channel reached 5 million views, strangely enough, now the very publishing companies that wouldn't publish anything I wrote, several years ago, were asking me to publish. So you can critique the guys here all you want. Conversations have gone global. And now and this has been going on for the last 8 years. I've had men reaching out to me from all over the world: China, South Africa, Australia, Canada, Alaska, telling me their experiences. And of course, all over the US, but telling me their experiences, Mexico, you name it. Countries from all over the world where men are taking cues from the discussions that Black men are having, in as much as their experiences mirror some of the things we're talking about. All over the continent of Africa, brothers are reaching out. Shout out to Brandon. He says, Doc, thanks for reminding us to listen to our own needs rather than worry about what others think about us. Indeed. Appreciate that. Let's see. Growth Talk says, we've been trained in trying to please our way since childhood. Exactly. And you learn this as a child. Your very well-being, before you can walk, before you can talk, is based on how well this person who's literally feeding you from her body perceives you. But we're going to act like that has no influence on how we engage women today. Okay. One thing that Black men, and men in general, but especially Black men, learn from a young age is rejection, particularly as young men. Rejection is actually a norm. For men, you actually have to work to achieve some degree, whether it's status or whether it's accomplishments on other grounds, but you have to achieve in order to move past rejection. But that's part of manhood in many respects. So this idea that somehow most men can't handle rejection makes no sense to me whatsoever. Rejection is part of the game of life. Now, obviously, there are individuals who can't handle it, but there are all kinds of men that deal with rejection every day. Matter of fact, one of the conversations I'm noticing happening in social media is women questioning whether they should initiate discussions with black men on the street because they're looking for partners and they're looking to date and all this kind of stuff. And one of the things they've been debating back and forth is whether women should initiate. But you know, one of the reasons that women hesitate to do so? Severe fear of rejection. See, men are socialized to experience rejection. Why? Because it's a social expectation that we initiate contact with new women, right? And men have been talking about this, for centuries. Even my lifetime, like from the '60s onward. I'm not that old. I'm '70s child, but if you listen to the music, it was, how do you woo a woman? How do you seduce a woman? How do you engage her in conversation? These were things that men studied. I grew up in the '80s and '90s. The love songs, all of that media was situated around how do we approach and initiate contact. And you got to understand the skill it takes to do this. You got to walk up to a woman you've never met before and say some shit that she might find interesting and that she's never heard before. And you're doing this with someone you've never met. Otherwise, and this was common as well, especially in the '90s, women would laugh at you and dismiss you. I grew up in an era where women would tell you, "You're too dark," or "I've heard that before. Get away." And if she's in a pack of people, trust me, it could be a problem. But these were the spaces that men had to cultivate a voice. Now, men that are withdrawing from initiating contact for other reasons, even as young as 13, 14 years old, before they've even gotten out the gate, they're starting to reject this. And people really underestimate why. They underestimate the breadth of what men are responding to. It's not just about being frustrated with women in terms of rejection. There's a lot going on there that goes beyond that. That's what the show has been preoccupied with for the last 8 years. It's much bigger than that. But it is a feature, right? And, rejection is something that we learn to experience. We learn to deal with. It is part of manhood. There are always going to be individuals that can't handle it. But I disagree with the notion that this is something somehow that most men have a problem with, and somehow you got to be responsible for the cat that no. If anything, women fear rejection far more than men because they're not socially expected to do it. We're used to it in many respects. But there are reasons men are pulling away from it. And much of it has to do with their social value. It's changing. It's increasing. It's moving in different directions. And they're finding support from other places in the world, from other spaces in the world. And it's changing the dynamics.